One night in March of 2016, two friends sat on a couch in Lunel, France, watching a true crime show on TV. And the episode really hit close to home, literally, because it was about a missing person who had vanished just miles away from where they lived. And so they're watching this show, and then all of a sudden, in the middle of it, one of the friends suddenly stood up and began pacing around the room, muttering to themselves. And when the other friend, who was still sitting on the couch watching this, asked them what was wrong, they were not ready for the answer. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer the like button a really nice, really expensive steak dinner. But make sure you first significantly dull their steak knife. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. At 4:30 p.m. on June 23, 2014, 49-year-old Patrick Isouard hurried out the side door of a hospital in Sète, France, buttoning a fresh-collared shirt as he ran to the parking lot. He climbed onto a scooter and then quickly checked his watch, and then he lifted the kickstand and sped off into traffic, ignoring honks from all the other drivers as he swerved between the cars. Patrick did not care who he was annoying right now, because he was running late for a date, and then right after the date, he had to rush over to his daughter's dance recital. And he desperately wanted to make sure he made both of these events, because they were some of the only things he'd had to look forward to in ages. So things in Patrick's life had not been good for a really long time. 8 years earlier, he had slipped into a rut of serious binge drinking and gambling. And one day, when he was drunk, he had actually struck his wife. Following that, his wife had divorced him, and he'd lost custody of his daughter, Alabama, who was now 12 years old. After that, Patrick's life really did not get any better. He had moved in with his elderly mother, and his drinking had only gotten worse, and his gambling continued to the point where he basically gambled away most of what he made by working as a hospital janitor. And then after that, he'd gotten involved with a married coworker, and then when her husband found out about this affair, she died of an apparent suicide. Her death had been 5 years earlier, and it had been so traumatic that Patrick had barely dated since. He had just about resigned himself to a life of bachelorhood, when actually a few weeks earlier, he had gotten a call from the woman he was now going to meet, Audrey Levay. But Patrick was now running so late for his date that he worried Audrey might not wait around for him. So he twisted the throttle of his scooter and shot across an intersection, ignoring more honks from more cars. Patrick had actually met Audrey a long time ago, right after his divorce, and they'd gone out a handful of times before they ultimately lost touch. She was a lot younger than he was, and she'd stood him up more than once in the past, but she was also a lot of fun, and it had been a while since Patrick had been on a date, so when she called him up saying she wanted to go out again, Patrick had said, sure. They'd made plans to meet this afternoon at a park near Patrick's work that had this big rocky hill rising behind it. And the place had some of the best views in the whole city, with the ocean on one side and dramatic cliffs dotted with all these old caves on the other. Now, they were not going to have a whole lot of time together, probably just enough for a short walk before Patrick would have to rush off for his daughter's dance recital later that night. But he hoped that the romantic setting might help spark something between them again. A few minutes later, Patrick pulled up to the park entrance, and to his relief, Audrey was still there waiting for him. So he parked his scooter and locked his cell phone in the scooter's underseat compartment, and he walked over to her. And from her nervous smile, he got the sense that she was almost as excited about the date as he was, which gave him a nice boost of confidence. So he took her hand, and they started down the path. Around 8 a.m. the next morning, 10 miles up the coastline from where Patrick and Audrey had been walking at that park, Patrick's older brother, Mark Isouard, stood on the deck of his boat, pulling a big oyster trap out of the water. As he was doing this, his phone rang, so he stopped and he answered it. But before he could even say hello, his mother's very worried voice came across the line, asking if he knew where Patrick was. Mark frowned, because Patrick lived with their mother, so she should know better than he would. But his mother explained that Patrick hadn't come home last night. He also wasn't answering his phone, he hadn't shown up to work that morning, and perhaps most concerning of all, he'd missed his daughter's dance recital the previous evening. And it was this last fact that made Mark think that something might actually be wrong here, because he knew how much Patrick loved his daughter and how much he was looking forward to that recital. So he promised his mother he would get to the bottom of it, then he hung up and began calling Patrick's friends. However, with each conversation he had, Mark got more worried, because nobody had heard from Patrick since yesterday afternoon. He'd apparently left work around 4 p.m., but he hadn't told anybody where he was going. Now for Mark, he felt like this was at least somewhere to start, Patrick's work. So he steered his boat to the dock, tied it off, and then jumped in his car and started heading that direction. 4 hours later, Mark stood on a rocky lookout point scanning the city below. Patrick's hospital stood in the middle of Set's business district, which was packed with canals and cafes and tourist spots, and Mark and a handful of Patrick's friends had spent all morning checking them one by one, looking for Patrick, but they hadn't found him or any sign of him. And so now Mark had turned his focus to some of the more remote areas around the city, like the hill behind the park where he now stood. But there was still no sign of Patrick anywhere. And so Mark was trying to think of anywhere else his brother might have gone when his phone rang. It was one of Patrick's friends from the search party, and he just found Patrick's scooter outside the park at the bottom of the hill, just a short drive from where Mark was. And so Mark told him not to touch anything, and he sprinted back to his car, and he sped down the hill, and he left the park, and he stopped in the parking lot right outside. And sure enough, there in the lot was Patrick's scooter. And as Mark looked at the scooter and at the quiet park all around him, he felt a cold weight settle in his stomach, because he really couldn't think of any reason why Patrick would leave his scooter here overnight. In the back of his mind, all day, Mark had been worried that something bad could have happened to his little brother. But now, after seeing this scooter, he felt sure of it. Almost 2 weeks later, at 8 a.m. on July 5th, 2014, Detective Boris Ferrier took the exit ramp toward the French town of Set. And as the sunlight hit his windshield, he had to squint as he looked out at the long stretch of beaches and canals framed by these beautiful rocky cliffs in a small, dense urban center. Ferrier was a senior investigator from the nearby city of Montpellier, but he had just been called in to take over a missing persons case that had stumped the local police in Set. About 2 weeks earlier, 49-year-old Patrick Iswar had disappeared after going on a date with a woman whose name was Audrey Louvet. The local police had already spoken to Audrey, who said she didn't know what had happened to Patrick. She said they had gone for a walk, and then he had escorted her to her bus, and then after that, she'd assumed that Patrick just sort of went back to his scooter and carried on with his night. But the scooter had been found the next day, still parked where he and Audrey had met up for their date, with no sign of Patrick anywhere nearby. And now, almost 2 weeks later, Patrick had still not turned up. Since then, Patrick's brother Mark had been helping the investigation. Ferrier had spoken to Mark on the phone, and Mark had talked about Patrick like he was a saint, a guy who would drop everything to help out somebody in a jam, who never got into fights and had really no enemies. But Ferrier didn't necessarily believe this, because in his experience, people who inexplicably vanished oftentimes were kidnapped or murdered. Now, he had no reason to actually suspect that around Patrick. He could have just as easily gotten into an accident, fallen off a cliff, or maybe he chose to vanish. But at this point, what Ferrier really needed to do was, on his own, dig into who Patrick was and figure out if there was a reason why he wasn't here right now. Do you want a treat that's both refreshing and indulgent? Well, My Mochi ice cream is creamy, premium ice cream wrapped in sweet, chewy dough that is absolutely satisfying and joyfully chill. My Mochi comes in delicious flavors like strawberry, mango, and cookies and cream. The strawberry is made with real fruit and tastes like biting into the perfect strawberry at peak summer. It's the perfect balance of chewy and creamy and fruity and cozy. But my favorite flavor is for sure cookies and cream. It's dreamy, creamy, and the cookie bits keep it fun. I take them out of the freezer and I let them soften up just a little bit, and then I can't stop eating them. My Mochi is also gluten-free and only around 70 calories per piece. It comes in a box with 6 individual snacks, which makes it really easy to share. That is, if you want to. Look for the purple box of My Mochi ice cream in the freezer aisle of your local grocery store. A few minutes later, Verrier followed Patrick's ex-wife, whose name was Claude Ozize, into her living room, and they both sat down. Verrier switched on his recording device, and he asked Claude where she was on the day Patrick went missing. Claude said it was just an ordinary Monday for her, and that after work she had picked up their daughter, Alabama, from school and driven her to her dance recital. She had expected to meet Patrick there at the recital, and it really surprised her when he didn't show up, because even though Patrick had plenty of flaws, he was a good dad. And at that, Verrier sort of leaned forward, because Patrick's flaws were actually what he wanted to know about. Now, he didn't think Claude was guilty of anything here, since she had a pretty strong alibi and didn't really stand to benefit from Patrick's disappearance. But he hoped she could maybe tell him about any old habits or current habits that could have gotten Patrick into trouble. And so when he asked her about this, Claude hesitated before saying she really didn't want to badmouth Patrick. But he drank and gambled a lot more than he should. At this point, Verrier pressed her for more details, but Claude just insisted that Patrick had really always kept that part of his life away from her. But after she thought about it for a moment, she said there was someone who might be able to tell Verrier more. And then she called their 12-year-old daughter, Alabama, into the room. Alabama appeared very visibly nervous and shaken up by everything going on with her dad, but her mother, Claude, took her hand and encouraged her to share her story. And slowly, the girl began to speak. She said that about a week before her dad disappeared, he'd brought her along on a very strange errand. They'd parked outside of a tunnel, and he'd told her to wait in the car. And then he got out and walked into this tunnel to meet with someone. It was a man. But it was too dark in the tunnel for Alabama to make out the man's features, but she definitely saw her father, Patrick, hand this man some kind of package before he quickly turned and ran back to the car. And then afterwards, her father wouldn't tell her who this man was. He just said that he'd done something really stupid, and because of it, he now owed some people a lot of money. After Alabama finished talking, her mother, Claude, thanked her and sent her back out of the room. And then once she was gone, Verrier asked Claude if she knew who this man in the tunnel might be, but Claude said she had no idea. But she said she did have one name that was worth looking into. Now, this was not someone who would have lent Patrick any money, but instead, it was a man who held a personal grudge against him. His name was Remy Chen, and he was a local hairstylist. An hour later, Verrier sat in a cramped cubicle of the Sète police station, scrolling through a file on his laptop. Based on Claude's tip, he'd looked up the hairstylist's name in the police database and had immediately found a connection to Patrick. Back in 2009, so a few years after Patrick's divorce, Patrick had been questioned as a witness in the suicide of Remy Chen's wife, a woman named Nadège Chen, who had worked with Patrick at the hospital. Apparently, Nadège had come home after a work party and confessed to Remy that she'd been having this affair with Patrick. The couple argued for hours about it, and Nadège ended up sleeping on the couch while Remy went upstairs to their bedroom. And then the next day, Remy found Nadège in their garage, hanging by the neck. As soon as Verrier was done reading this, he knew he finally had a suspect, and so he looked up Remy's last known address and contact information. At around 10 a.m. the next day, so July 7th, Verrier followed Remy Chen into an interrogation room at the Sète police station and shut the door behind them. Remy was a short, wiry man with a very obvious scowl on his face that made it clear he thought he was being very inconvenienced here. Verrier immediately got the feeling that Remy would likely only crack under intense pressure. So right away, he tried to shake Remy by saying they knew he was involved in the kidnapping of Patrick Isouard. Now, this was a total bluff because Verrier did not actually have any evidence, but he wanted to see how Remy would react. And to his surprise and irritation, Remy just laughed. Remy acted like he literally had no idea who Verrier was even talking about. And when Verrier brought up his late wife and sort of insinuated that obviously Patrick had had an affair and was a witness when she had died, Remy just scoffed and reminded him that it had been 5 years since her passing. He said he had moved on and begun dating other people. And anyways, it was sort of absurd to think that he would hold a grudge for 5 years without doing anything, but then suddenly now decide to take some sort of revenge out of the blue. It just didn't add up. But Verrier didn't really know what to make of this. It seemed like Remy was really confident, almost too confident. And so he pivoted and just asked Remy where he was on June 23rd, the day Patrick went missing. And after thinking for a moment, Remy just said that he had spent the whole afternoon alone cleaning out a storage unit that he had rented. This was obviously not a great alibi at all, but at this point, Verrier had no choice but to let Remy go. As Verrier watched Remy leave, he knew he was running out of time here. 2 weeks had already passed since Patrick's disappearance, and every day the odds of finding him alive got worse. So out of desperation, Verrier decided to circle back to the very start and speak again to Audrey Louvet. Being the last person to see Patrick before he went missing, Audrey was an obvious person of interest, but Verrier wasn't sure what more he could learn from her. The local police had already questioned her at the very beginning of the investigation, and Verrier had already watched that interview tape a number of times. But Verrier knew he just had to take a shot. So he picked up the phone and he called Audrey into the station. Later that same afternoon, around 2 p.m., Verrier sat across from Audrey in the same room where he just interviewed Remy. He said hello to her and he started the recorder, and then he asked her to explain her history with Patrick again. And at first, her answers were all just like they'd been on the tape. She said they had met 8 years ago in 2006, and they'd dated casually for a while before losing contact. And then, just a few weeks ago, she happened to pass the bar where they first met, and it made her think of Patrick. So she'd called him up out of the blue to ask how he was doing, and they'd ultimately made plans to see each other again. She described their date as being a short walk around the park, after which Patrick had walked her to the bus stop and then headed off, presumably to go back to his scooter and to head off to his daughter's dance recital. And that's when Verrier interrupted, and he asked Audrey to tell him specifically which direction Patrick had headed off after dropping her off at the bus stop. And Audrey sat there for a minute, and then she said, I can't remember. And this really bothered Verrier, because here was this person who should be able to tell him the most about Patrick's last moves, and she had basically nothing useful to offer the investigation. So Verrier just sort of dropped the polite tone and really went after her. He told her he wasn't buying her act and that she needed to tell him everything she knew right now, or this was all going to get much, much worse for her. Audrey's eyes went wide and her voice began to shake as she insisted that she'd already told them everything. But Verrier didn't let up. He kept demanding that she just admit what she'd done until he was practically shouting at her. And Audrey was in tears and she was repeating over and over that Patrick had been fine when she left him. She just didn't remember all the details. And finally, Verrier backed off. He'd run countless interrogations throughout his career, and his gut was starting to tell him that Audrey's fragility was not really an act here. He'd pushed her as hard as he could, and he had to admit that maybe she was just telling the truth. A little while later, after Audrey was gone, Verrier sat alone inside the interrogation room thinking about the case. He hadn't managed to rule out any suspects yet, and he still had no idea who that mysterious man in the tunnel might be. And on top of all that, there was still the possibility that no crime had been committed here, since they had no body. Who knows what really happened to Patrick at this point? And Verrier knew that there were just too many unknowns. And Verrier knew that if the case was ever going to gain real traction, they needed to find Patrick, dead or alive. Around 11 a.m. on July 17th, so 3.5 weeks after Patrick Isouard disappeared, Detective Boris Verrier parked along the shoulder of a winding roadside in the French town of Sète. He got out of his car, he stooped beneath a strip of yellow police tape, and he headed across the long strip of dry grass leading up to a sheer cliff wall. A dozen yards ahead of him, barely visible in the rock face, was the dark, round opening of a cave. A few hours earlier, a group of teenagers had shown up at the police station seeming very frazzled, saying they had found a human body inside of that cave. And as soon as Verrier had heard about this, he had rushed to the scene because the cave was less than a half a mile away from where Patrick's scooter had been abandoned. And so now, Verrier turned on his flashlight and he stepped into the cave. And as soon as he did, a forensics team fell into step right behind him, and together, they began making their way into the darkness. Thanks to his flashlight, Verrier could see that the walls were covered in graffiti and that there were empty bottles and other garbage everywhere. So it seemed like this was probably a popular party spot for young people. As they moved deeper, the cave split off into a maze of all these different narrow tunnels. And just as Verrier was about to direct his team to spread out and begin searching all of them, he passed by one of these tunnels that absolutely reeked. And so Verrier stopped what he was doing and just aimed his flashlight down this particular tunnel. And he saw there was a shallow pit dug into the floor. and lying at the bottom of this pit was what looked like a ragged lump of black fabric, until Verrier stepped closer. The smell was overpowering now, and Verrier knew he was standing over the charred remains of a human body. Verrier bent down to examine it, and he saw right away there was what appeared to be a bullet hole in the skull and a bullet hole to the torso. And those details, one to the head, one to the stomach, and then, the body being burnt afterwards, likely to get rid of evidence, felt very familiar to Verrier. It felt like this could have been a mob hit. A year and a half later, so just before Christmas of 2015, Detective Verrier was in his office in Montpellier when his phone rang. It was Patrick's older brother, Marc, calling to ask for updates on his brother's case, again. And Verrier sighed because the truth was, he had nothing new to report. The body in the cave had been confirmed to be Patrick, and so Verrier had hoped that that discovery would lead to all these new leads. But after scouring the cave for clues and testing the cigarettes from the scene for DNA and speaking to the teenagers who reported the body, the case just hit a dead end. Now, the mob-like execution style did line up with a theory that Verrier had that, maybe Patrick had been killed over a gambling debt, by the mob basically, or someone who was affiliated with, organized crime. But Verrier had never been able to actually uncover any trace of Patrick having any sort of debt that would get him killed. Also, he still had not been able to identify that mysterious man in the tunnel that Patrick's daughter had mentioned. And so that left Remy and also Audrey as his only suspects. And Verrier had placed both of them under surveillance, but so far, neither of them had done anything suspicious. So the investigation was now stuck, and Verrier understood that Patrick's family was really out of patience here. So he was not surprised that when he admitted he still was not ready to make an arrest, Marc snapped. He told Verrier that if the police weren't capable of solving this, he was going to take matters into his own hands. 3 months later, on a night in March of 2016, Detective Verrier sat down on his couch in his living room to watch something that he'd been warned was coming. Marc had convinced the producers of a national true crime TV show to do an episode on his brother's case, and the episode was airing tonight. And as the show started, Verrier felt a knot of anxiety, because Marc knew details about the investigation that were not meant for the public, and if he shared them on this show, it could seriously compromise the case. But obviously, Verrier was also just curious to see how the episode had turned out, and part of him hoped that maybe renewed public attention might actually help the case. And as Verrier watched the show, he was relieved to see that Marc wasn't there to talk about case specifics. He was there to talk about Patrick. Marc described his brother as this hardworking father who never seemed to catch a break in life, and who at the very least deserved justice. And at the end, he put out a simple plea for anyone with information to please come forward. When the show ended, Verrier did not really feel worried anymore that anything that had been revealed on the show was sensitive or that it could negatively impact the actual investigation. But he also knew that, the impact the show was going to have was probably going to be pretty small. Like, he didn't expect anything to come of this plea for help from the public. However, he would be wrong, because the next morning, Verrier's phone would ring. And an hour after that call came in, Verrier was ringing the doorbell of an apartment building in Lunel, which is a town close to Sète. A woman would answer the door, and when Verrier flashed his badge, she invited him inside. The woman, whose name was Sophie, had reached out to the police after watching Marc's interview on TV, saying she did have information about Patrick's case. And so Verrier followed her into her kitchen, and he sat down across the table from her, and he turned on his recorder, and he told her to just start from the beginning. And the moment the story began to spill out, Verrier knew he'd solved the case. Based on the evidence collected at the crime scene and witness testimony, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Patrick Isouard on the afternoon of Monday, June 23, 2014. At 4:30 p.m., the killer stood on a rocky hill overlooking a park in Sète, watching through a pair of binoculars while Patrick and Audrey walked hand in hand down a paved path below. The couple was taking their time, clearly enjoying the scenery and each other's company, and then at some point, Audrey stopped and pointed across the road at a cave in the nearby cliffs, the entrance to a cave. And when the killer saw this, their heart began to race, and they watched intently as the couple actually crossed the road and went into the cave and vanished. At this point, the killer lowered their binoculars and put them inside of the large duffel bag they had brought with them. Then, after slinging this bag, they hustled down the hill and went right to the entrance of the cave. When they reached the entrance to the cave, they stopped, and they put that bag on the ground. They unzipped it, and out of it they pulled a large rifle, a roll of duct tape, and also a white mask. The killer put the mask on, and with the rifle and tape in hand, they entered the cave. And they could hear the sound of Patrick and Audrey inside. They had not gone far, and they clearly had not clocked the killer coming in. They were sort of wrapped up in their date. However, when the killer got close enough, the couple heard their footsteps, and they turned around. When Audrey saw the killer in their mask with the gun, she began to scream, and Patrick, he just went white as a ghost. Before the couple could even react, the killer threw the duct tape at Audrey and told her that if she wanted to live, she would do exactly as instructed. Then the killer told Audrey to use this tape and bind Patrick's wrists and ankles. And at first, Audrey just stood there in stunned silence, but eventually she composed herself and she obeyed. And as she was binding Patrick just also stood there in stunned silence, not really sure what to even do. When Audrey was done, the killer told her to leave the cave and to not say anything about what had happened here. She hesitated just long enough to glance back at Patrick, but then she turned and she ran. Once her footsteps had faded and it was just the killer and Patrick inside of this cave, Patrick just stared, wondering what was going to happen to him, and the killer, after making really intense eye contact with Patrick, raised his rifle and shot Patrick in the head and also once in the chest, and Patrick crumpled to the ground. At that point, the killer slung his rifle, and then he grabbed Patrick by the ankles and he dragged his body down a nearby tunnel and dumped him in that shallow pit. Then the killer doused the body with lighter fluid from a canister they'd brought in that bag. They lit a match and tossed it in. As Patrick's body began to burn, the killer walked out of the cave and pulled off their mask as soon as they stepped into the light. They now had only one thing left to do: go find Audrey and explain everything, and convince her not to go to the police. Because the killer was Remy Shen, the hairstylist who hated Patrick for having an affair with his late wife, and he had just successfully tricked Audrey into helping him pull this murder off. It would turn out Audrey was actually Remy's ex-girlfriend. They had met and begun dating in 2009, shortly after the death of Remy's wife. And Remy had realized that because of Audrey's history with Patrick, because they had also dated, he could use her to lure Patrick into a trap and finally take his revenge. But even though Audrey was clearly a key part of this plan, she didn't actually know that Remy was going to kill Patrick. Remy had told her a sob story about Patrick owing him a lot of money, and she thought they were just going to scare him into paying up. It was not until she got into the cave and Remy showed up with a mask on and a rifle that she realized he had something way more sinister in his mind. After the murder, Remy convinced Audrey to stay silent by threatening to kill her and her children. And for over a year, she kept his secret, lying to the police the whole time. But when she watched that true crime episode about the case and saw Mark's plea for information, she finally just cracked and confessed to her friend Sophie, who was watching the show with her, who then went on to call the police the very next day. On March 31st, 2016, Remy Shen and Audrey Louvet were arrested for their roles in Patrick's death. Remy received 30 years in prison for murder, and Audrey was sentenced to 12 years for acting as an accessory to the kidnapping. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. In today's episode, I'm going to tell you 3 true stories about people who made choices that are so shocking, you'll find yourself leaning in closer just to make sure you heard that right. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please break into the like button's car and remove their steering wheel. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. One weekday morning in March of 1995, a man named Luther Charles sat on the porch of his parents' house in St. Louis, Missouri, while holding a newspaper. Both of Luther's parents were at work, but Luther was not, because he didn't have a job. In fact, he hadn't had a single job in the last 5 years. So Luther desperately wanted to be an actor professionally. And he'd spent the last 5 years, not working, but auditioning constantly and getting rejected over and over and over again. Now he was totally broke and living with his parents, but he had not lost the dream of wanting to be an actor. Now, Luther knew that a lot of people, at least outside of the acting world, thought that trying to be an actor was sort of a pipe dream. Only chosen few get to do that professionally at a high level. And that he, Luther, should be more realistic and just get a normal job, especially after 5 years of attempts that didn't work out. But he just couldn't bring himself to do that, because for him, it was going to be acting or nothing. So on this particular morning, he was doing what he did almost every single day, which was flipping through the classified section of the newspaper, looking for any open calls for auditions. And as he scanned the page he was on, he saw one that caught his eye. It was for a musical that was being produced several hundred miles away in Ohio, but they had an open call for auditions that night. Now, at first, Luther was kind of confused about why producers from Ohio would place a call for auditions in a newspaper in Missouri. But then he saw that it was because these producers were trying to find a very specific kind of actor for what sounded like a very unique character. And Luther realized he could be what they were looking for. This could finally be his chance to get his big break. This was, of course, not going to be easy. Number one, he would have to drive today all the way to Ohio just to do this audition. But two, what it would take for him to get into this character, to do a good job and hopefully land this part, was going to take a lot. But after 5 years of near constant rejection, he was willing to try anything. A few minutes later, Luther got into the driver's seat of his car. He was carrying 3 things with him: a map to help him get to Ohio, an entire bottle of whiskey to help him be brave, and a hacksaw to help him get into character. That evening in Ohio, one of the producers of this musical sat in the front row of an empty auditorium. She'd spent the last several hours listening to hopeful actors read monologues and sing songs, and she knew there were still more people waiting to audition. So she called for the next person in line to come inside. And a moment later, a man stumbled out onto the stage, and when the producer saw him, she was just confused because he seemed very wobbly, almost like he was drunk, and he had on this weird sort of costume where he had bandages wrapped around his head. And then, in a very slurred voice, this man said his name was Luther Charles, and he knew that this musical required a very specific kind of actor, and he had made sure that he was perfect for this part. The producer didn't understand what Luther was talking about, though. But before she could clarify, Luther, on stage, began unwrapping the bandages from his head. And when the producer saw what was underneath them, she began screaming for help. It would turn out that casting call in the newspaper that Luther read that inspired him to go here and do this contained a very unfortunate typo. What the producers of the musical were looking for were genuine, fearless actors. But what actually got printed was a call for, quote, genuine, earless actors. And Luther Charles was so desperate to land a role that he drove to Ohio, downed a bottle of whiskey, and then cut off both of his ears with that hacksaw because he believed it would make him perfect for this musical. Luther survived his self-inflicted injuries and later underwent psychiatric treatment. He did not, however, get the part. BetterHelp is the paid partner of today's video. The strangest part isn't coming home. It's realizing you came back, but your mind didn't. You're trying to move through life doing everything right, work, family, responsibilities. But small moments feel off, and later you're left thinking, what's wrong with me? I also went through these exact same feelings when I left the military. My mind was very conflicted because the world sort of expected me to be normal, but it was like my nervous system still expected danger all the time. Trauma doesn't stay back there. It rewires you. It changes how you react, how you trust, how you love. But therapy can help break that pattern. BetterHelp makes that support easier to access. You fill out a short questionnaire and get matched with a credentialed therapist in as little as a couple of days. If it's not the right fit, you can switch anytime. Join the 6 million plus people who have gotten help from BetterHelp, the platform you can trust. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/MrBallen and get 10% off your first month of therapy. On an evening in October of 2003, a woman named Tina carried a grocery bag down the hallway of a big apartment building in Harlem, New York. The hallway was narrow, with white tile walls and heavy metal doors and overhead lights that flickered. And as Tina stopped in front of her door, she caught a whiff of a familiar smell coming from across the hall in apartment 5E. It smelled like urine and rotting meat. Tina grimaced, but quickly set down her grocery bag and began sifting through her purse for her keys. But right as she found them, she heard footsteps coming down the hall behind her. She turned, and when she saw who was walking up the hallway towards her, she began to panic because it was Antoine Yates, the owner of apartment 5E, the stinky apartment. He was coming right down the hall, and he was carrying what appeared to be this huge sack that maybe looked like it was filled with sand or something. She didn't care, but she did not want to be near this guy. And so as fast as she could, she put the key in the door, opened it up, flew inside, grabbed her groceries, shut the door, and deadbolted it. Now, Tina did feel sort of guilty about being really obviously rude towards Antoine. I mean, Antoine had lived in this building for years, and at one point she had thought he was a nice guy. But lately, he'd gotten really weird, and she no longer wanted anything to do with him. First of all, there was that horrific smell coming from his apartment basically at all hours. And then there was the fact that Antoine basically stopped leaving the apartment altogether. Like he was basically in his apartment 24/7. As far as Tina could tell, he maybe left once a day, tops, for maybe like an hour a day. But other than that, he was like a constant presence across the hall. But beyond the smell and his reclusive nature, the most sort of alarming aspect of his recent weird behavior were all the random loud crashing sounds that Tina would hear coming from Antoine's apartment at all hours, even though from what she could tell, he didn't have any visitors ever. It was just him in there. Now, Tina had no idea what Antoine was doing in there, but she assumed whatever it wasn't good, but it wasn't her business. And so she decided that the best thing she could do was just stay in her apartment, make sure the door was locked, and hope at some point he stopped doing whatever it was he was doing. A couple days later, Tina went down to the lobby to check her mail. And when she did, she ran into a woman named Joyce who lived in apartment 4E, which was directly below Antoine's apartment. Tina said hello to her, and as she opened up her mailbox, Joyce came over and stood next to her with this sort of strange look on her face. Tina picked up on it and asked her what was wrong. And Joyce told her that last night she'd noticed liquid dripping down through her ceiling. And at first she thought it was maybe a burst pipe or an overflowing sink. But when she got a rag and went to clean it up, she realized it wasn't water. It smelled like pee. Then Joyce, she lowered her voice and leaned in close to Tina. And she said the pee wasn't the only weird thing. Sometimes late at night, when the building was quiet, she said she could hear what sounded like whimpering coming from the upstairs apartment, Antoine's apartment. And at this, Tina's heart began to pound. Now, she had tried to just kind of, mentally and physically avoid the whole Antoine situation, whatever it was. But now that she knew other neighbors were also noticing bizarre things like she was, she felt like she had to act. And so Tina said to Joyce that, you know what, we really ought to call the housing authority and see if they'd come out and investigate to see what was going on. But Joyce said she'd already tried that. She'd called multiple times, and so far, nobody had done anything. So Tina told Joyce that, okay, well, let's all get together, all the other neighbors, and go to the housing authority as a group. And maybe then they'd be taken more seriously. Joyce liked the idea, so the two women exchanged numbers, and then Tina went back up to her apartment. But the next day, before Tina had time to chat with any more neighbors, she came home from the store and walked into the lobby of the apartment building, and she saw Antoine on the floor of the lobby screaming in pain with two police officers huddled over him. He had these gaping wounds all over his arm and his leg, and there was blood all over the tile floor. Tina didn't know what to do, so she just hustled right past them through the lobby, made her way upstairs, and got inside her apartment. But once she was inside, her curiosity got the best of her, and she ran to the window to see if there was anything going on outside that could begin to explain what was going on with Antoine. And outside, she saw an ambulance pull up, and then moments later, paramedics loaded Antoine into the back of it, and they took off. After that, Tina basically sat there expecting any moment for the police to come barreling down the hallway and break down Antoine's door, apartment 5E, to finally put an end to whatever was happening inside of there. But she sat there waiting for an hour, and she didn't hear anything. And then finally, after, about an hour, she saw those two police officers from the lobby get back in their squad car and drive away. Tina was shocked. She had no idea what happened to Antoine, but she also couldn't conceptualize of what Antoine would have told those officers that would make them think they should just leave without checking his apartment. And so Tina felt like she couldn't just sit here and do nothing, like somebody needed to go in there. Tina didn't know if maybe Antoine was hurting someone in his apartment and they had finally fought back, that's why he was all cut up, or maybe if he was involved in some kind of violent criminal activity or what, but it was clearly never going to end unless she spoke up. So, as much as it terrified her to get involved here, she picked up the phone, called the police, and told them everything she had seen and heard. The next day, Tina was coming home from work when she saw this huge crowd gathered outside her apartment building. Hundreds of her neighbors were just standing on the sidewalk looking up at the side of the building. And when Tina looked up, she saw what they were watching. A police officer was rappelling down the side of this building from one of the upper levels, and with him he had this big rifle and some other huge weapon, and he was slowly making his way down. But then he eventually stopped right outside a 5th floor window. And Tina realized he was stopping outside of Antoine's window. That was his apartment. And so Tina and the others watched as this officer began to tap on the glass of the window. And then there was this huge explosion of glass that flew outwards, like the window had broken, but from the inside going out. That officer immediately raised his rifle and began firing into the apartment while also signaling to the police officers above him, leaning out of another apartment to pull him up. And they immediately began pulling him up. And then a few minutes later, a half dozen more police officers came running out the front door of the apartment building, and they were carrying this massive tarp between them with something obviously very heavy and large inside of it. Now, none of this made any sense to Tina until the officers passed by her and she caught a glimpse of what was in the tarp. It would turn out Tina and Joyce were right to be suspicious of Antoine, but it wasn't because he was a violent criminal who was secretly hurting people in his apartment. No, his secret was actually much weirder. Antoine had a very strange pet. Specifically, he had a 400-pound tiger named Ming, who had been living in Antoine's apartment for years. It slept in one of his bedrooms with a giant sand pit. It peed basically everywhere, and it lived off raw meat. Antoine's horrible wounds that day were caused by Ming biting him when Antoine tried to stop the tiger from pouncing on one of his other pets, a stray kitten that he had taken in. As for Antoine and Ming, they both survived this encounter. Antoine was ultimately arrested for reckless endangerment, and Ming, who was just tranquilized during that exchange with the police officer, was carried out of the apartment and taken to a sanctuary in Ohio. Also, that stray kitten survived the attack as well. At 2:45 p.m. on January 6, 1995, A 45-year-old man named MacArthur Wheeler walked towards the front doors of a bank in Swissvale, Pennsylvania, which is a small town near Pittsburgh. MacArthur had on a mask and was dressed in a big blue parka, and in one of his pockets, he was carrying a semi-automatic handgun. MacArthur was about to rob this bank at gunpoint. But weirdly, he did not feel nervous, despite the fact that, MacArthur had never robbed a bank before. But one of his friends, 43-year-old Clifton Johnson, had. And Clifton was already inside the bank, waiting in line and pretending to be a customer, even though he was actually MacArthur's co-conspirator. MacArthur and Clifton had spent days planning out this robbery together, down to every last detail. And even though MacArthur had been kind of scared at first, Clifton had talked him through every possible scenario and made sure that they had a plan for everything that could go wrong. So now MacArthur was 100% confident that they were going to get away with this, which again is why he was not nervous. So this day, MacArthur walked up to the bank's doors and went inside. He had to squint through his mask because it obscured his view a little bit, but he saw Clifton standing in line, which immediately gave him another burst of confidence to actually see Clifton. He was here. So far, things were going exactly as planned. And so MacArthur quickly pushed his way through the line, and he locked eyes with the bank teller. And as he did, he pulled out his gun, he aimed it at them, and he told them to hand over all the money. MacArthur heard the sound of other people in the bank, other patrons and other staff beginning to gasp because they're seeing what's happening here. And so MacArthur quickly turned around with his gun still in his hand, and he told everybody that he didn't want to hurt anyone. Everybody just needed to stay calm, and as soon as he got the money, he'd be gone. Then MacArthur turned back to the teller, who by this point had gathered up all the cash in the register and was literally just holding it out like, here, take it. And MacArthur, he grabbed the cash, put it in one of his pockets, he put his gun back inside of his pocket. Then he looked over at Clifton, and the two men nodded, and then they turned and ran out of the bank. About 3 months later, in the early morning hours of April 20th, 1995, MacArthur was sleeping inside his apartment just outside of Pittsburgh. After the robbery, he and Clifton had escaped with a little over $5,000, and they'd gone their separate ways in order to lay low. So they weren't really in contact, but to MacArthur, it seemed like everything had worked out perfectly, because here he was, still a free man with all this cash. And the cops hadn't even shown up once to question him. But on this particular night, a pounding on MacArthur's door woke him up. And he bolted upright in bed, and he heard somebody yell at him to open up, because it was the police. Now at this point, MacArthur was definitely nervous. However, he sort of calmed himself down and told himself that right now his best option was just to play it cool. Because even if the cops suspected him in that robbery, there was simply no way they could possibly prove he'd actually done it. He'd been wearing a mask and a huge parka that totally obscured his identity. So MacArthur, he got out of bed and he walked over to the door, he opened it up, and sure enough, there's all these police officers standing in the doorway. And MacArthur pretended to act confused and asked them, what's going on here? And that was when one of the officers told MacArthur he was under arrest for armed robbery, and then showed him a printed photo from one of the bank's security cameras, and clear as day, there he was. So this photo clearly showed MacArthur's face. Every detail was perfectly visible. It was him, for sure. He didn't even look like he was wearing a mask. But MacArthur couldn't wrap his mind around how this was possible. He looked from the picture up to the cops and just said, "But I wore the juice." It would turn out the mask MacArthur was wearing during this robbery was not a ski mask or a Halloween mask or really a mask in any traditional sense of the word. What MacArthur and his co-conspirator Clifton had both done, and what they truly thought would disguise their identities completely, was rub lemon juice on their faces. They believed that lemon juice would essentially act as a mask and make them literally invisible to security cameras. Unfortunately though, lemon juice does not make you invisible. And so once the police accessed the bank's security footage, they saw clear as day MacArthur and Clifton committing this crime, and they arrested them both. Clifton was sentenced to 5 years in prison for armed bank robbery, and MacArthur was sentenced to 22.5 years. But this was not the end of the story, because Clifton and MacArthur's ridiculous crime made headlines. And before long, a professor of social psychology at Cornell University read about it. and it made him realize something. The fact that MacArthur literally believed lemon juice would make him invisible, and he acted on that knowledge, or that supposed knowledge, to commit this crime, and then was shocked when it didn't work, that suggests a level of stupidity that is just exceptionally high. So high that this professor began to wonder if maybe MacArthur is so stupid, he actually doesn't understand how stupid he really was. And so this led the professor to research this idea. And he ultimately established a new psychological concept that we now call the Dunning-Kruger effect, which essentially says that the more incompetent a person is at something, the less likely they are to recognize their own incompetence. Basically, the dumber you are, the more confident you become. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. On a cold night in early February of 2010, a group of friends gathered around the table at a restaurant inside of a French ski resort. They had been out on the slopes all day, and now they were warming up and relaxing with some mulled wine by the fire. Eventually, a cell phone buzzed, and one of the friends, they looked at their phone and immediately frowned. Then, without saying anything, they excused themselves and stepped away from the table to talk. And then when they came back, they were pale, their hands were shaking, and the others asked them, are you okay? Who are you talking to? But this person, they just shook their head, grabbed their coat, and said they had to leave right now. Someone they cared about very much needed their help. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times a week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the like button's house and replace all the foam in their mattress with rocks. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the afternoon of Saturday, February 6th, 2010, 61-year-old Alan Lelu set up the ironing board behind the couch in the living room of a little house outside the town of Chartres in northern France. From the kitchen, he could smell the beef bourguignon simmering on the stove, but Alan and the 37-year-old woman who was cooking the beef bourguignon were not talking. The woman's name was Alexandra Nicola, and Alan had actually bought this house for her and her 10-year-old daughter. Alexandra used to be Alan's assistant, but over the years, they had developed a really close relationship that was much more like father to daughter. Now, Alexandra had not worked for Alan in a number of years, but, they remained close. And also, remember, Alan literally bought her this house. And so as a result of this bond they had, Alan found himself visiting her quite a bit at this house, helping out where he could, and he also paid for her car and also for their vacations. And Alan could afford to be this generous because he was a very successful, high-powered producer of circus shows, which were a huge moneymaker in France. Lots of companies booked circus shows for end-of-the-year parties for their employees, and Alan had lots of major contracts. And so as a result, Alan's office was in this fancy chateau in the countryside, and his wife actually lived in this luxury ski town near the Swiss border, and Alan was constantly traveling all over Europe for work. But this life could also be a grind. Just in the past 24 hours, Alan had traveled more than 1,200 miles, meeting with potential clients and scouting new performers. So he put a lot of value on the time where he could escape to Alexandra's house, where he could recharge in the quiet of the suburbs, and obviously spend time with somebody he cared a lot about. Now, Alan knew all of his friends and coworkers thought that he and Alexandra were blatantly having an affair here, and he was sure that's what his own wife assumed too. And this was fair, because after all, Alan did have lots of extramarital relationships. He also engaged with sex workers all the time, and he really didn't even try to hide any of it. He and his wife, Elizabeth, they lived in separate homes, and they sort of had this understanding that she can have this life, and he can have this life in exchange. However, Allen's relationship with Alexandra really was different. It had always been platonic. They'd never even kissed or held hands. Allen had no kids of his own, and he genuinely enjoyed playing the role of, doting father and grandfather to Alexandra and her daughter respectively. But now they were in this big fight, and Allen was anxious to repair it. Alexandra's daughter was out of the house for the weekend, so he and Alexandra had planned to have this nice dinner tonight before Allen had to head out again on business on Sunday afternoon. But Allen, somewhat stupidly, had brought up Alexandra's past, and they'd ended up getting into this horrible fight and just continued to yell at each other ever since. Alexandra was very defensive about her troubled history. When she was a young woman, she had moved to Paris and she had fallen in love and she had had a baby, but the baby had tragically died, and her relationship with her love had fallen apart, and so she had spiraled into very self-destructive behavior. By the time Allen finally met her in 2002, so this is 8 years before they were in this house having this big fight, Alexandra was really struggling. By this point, she had a 2-year-old daughter, and she was really struggling to provide for her because all she could muster in terms of work was like this combination of minimum wage jobs and side hustles. And so when Allen had hired her as his, full-time secretary, it had completely transformed her life. But, deep down, sometimes she seemed more resentful of Allen's power than grateful for his help. It's like he had total control over her well-being, and she didn't necessarily like that. And so with that as context, Allen left the ironing board and walked into the kitchen, hoping that Alexandra had cooled down enough that they could actually have a real conversation here. And so once he was in the kitchen, he sort of looked over at Alexandra and couldn't really tell where she was at, and then he turned, opened up the fridge, and just kind of stared inside of it, not really looking for any food or drink or anything. He was just hoping that Alexandra would say something to him. And to his relief, Alexandra did turn around and kind of playfully swung her dish towel at him, telling him that he had to wait for dinner. She didn't seem mad at him anymore, so Allen felt very relieved, and he smiled and closed the fridge, and then he told her to come sit with him and have some wine while they waited for the laundry to dry so she could iron it. A few minutes later, they both sat down on the sofa with their wine glasses, and Alexandra asked Allen how business was going. He told her it was good, which technically it was. This company was on track to bring in around 4 million euros that year, which is the equivalent of about 5 million US dollars. But despite how things looked on paper, Allen was pretty stressed. He made the majority of his money through contracts with companies, but he was not the only person competing for those lucrative contracts. His number one competitor was another circus owner whose name was Michel de la Rue. And recently, Michel had been beating Allen on one contract after another. And it was starting to feel to Allen like Michel was actually targeting Allen's contracts, trying to steal them from him, rather than trying to cultivate his own clients. Allen told Alexandra that on Monday, he had a very important meeting in Vichy, which is a city in central France about a 4-hour drive south of Alexandra's house. At this meeting, Allen was hoping to win a big contract, as long as Michel didn't steal it out from under him. Alexandra put her hand on Allen's arm and told him, "Don't worry." She said she was sure his meeting on Monday would be a huge success and they could celebrate in a few weeks on the ski trip that he had booked for the two of them and her daughter. Then she put down her now empty wine glass and went to go do the laundry. As Alexandra disappeared into the back of the house, Allen just kind of sat by himself for a minute. He was looking forward to the vacation that she had mentioned, in part because Alexandra had been a lot busier lately with her new boyfriend, a 42-year-old IT engineer from Paris named Yves Bernard. Now, Allen and Yves got along just fine, but he could tell that, Alexandra and Yves were getting pretty serious. They might even get married. And Allen couldn't help but worry that eventually, if that happened, Yves might start to resent him for sort of stepping in as this paternal figure in Alexandra's life, that perhaps he would come off as being sort of overbearing. But he was not going to let that fear wreck the evening. So as Alexandra came back now with the laundry, picked up a book from the coffee table, and took the last sip of his wine. The rest of the weekend passed by quickly, and by Sunday afternoon, Allen was back in his car, headed back out of town. But what no one would realize until much later was there was actually a second car following closely behind him. The following day, on the morning of Monday, February 8th, Alan Lilu's wife, Elizabeth, was drinking a coffee inside her home in the mountains when her phone rang. She picked it up, and she heard the voice of Alan's assistant, Sylvie. And Sylvie sounded very worried, and she said she was calling to see if Elizabeth had heard from her husband recently. And this was pretty strange, because Alan was not the type of person to just disappear from work without telling his secretary. So Elizabeth told Sylvie that no, she hadn't heard from Alan in a few days. And then she asked Sylvie, why? What's going on here? And as Elizabeth listened to Sylvie's answer, she felt herself growing really nervous. Because apparently, Alan had this very important meeting in Vichy that morning, but he had not shown up for it. In fact, he'd never even checked into the hotel in Vichy where he was supposed to be staying. Sylvie said she had already reached out to several of Alan's friends and business contacts, but nobody had heard from him. And he was not answering the repeated phone calls to both of his cell phones, which appeared to be turned off. None of this made any sense to Elizabeth. Alan was famous for spending entire days on his various phones. She couldn't even recall a time when he'd been unreachable, even briefly. So Elizabeth told Sylvie she was glad she called, but she would take it from here. Then Elizabeth hung up the phone with Sylvie and called the police. Hey guys, I have some pretty big news. I know many of you are excited to hear. I am going to be doing another live storytelling tour this year. You can find me in a bunch of cities, including new ones on the West Coast and across the United States, where I have never played before. Plus, I'm really excited to share that I will also be performing in an international city, since so many of you have been asking me to visit. We put together an absolutely amazing show with a whole bunch of awesome stories, including stories you will not hear anywhere else. New content you can only get if you come to this show. And guess what? Tickets for this tour are available right now at tour.ballenstudios.com. In terms of the types of tickets you can buy, they range from general admission to VIP. Again, that's tour.ballenstudios.com. I'm also going to be giving away a trip to meet me at one of my live shows. And so if you want to enter for your chance to win that, all you have to do is donate to win at fandiem.com/MrBallen. Again, that's fandiem.com/MrBallen. Get your tickets and enter the sweepstakes today. I can't wait to see you at the show. A week and a half later, on February 19th, a young police officer knocked on the front door of a little house outside the town of Chartres in northern France. Now, up until this point, Alan's case had been treated as a simple missing persons case, with the local police in Alan's wife's hometown handling the inquiry, which was pretty basic. But now, enough time had passed without Alan being found and no evidence coming in, that the original report had been kicked over to the crime division because they were thinking this could potentially be a kidnapping or something worse. This young officer was here at this home because it was the last place Alan was known to be before he went missing. The door of the home opened, and a thin blonde woman looked out. The officer asked her if her name was Alexandra Nicola, and she said yes. When he explained to her why he was there, Alexandra looked immediately concerned and invited him inside. And as she led him into her living room and offered him a seat on her couch, the officer looked around, taking stock of the space. It was clean, but a bit cluttered, with toys that appeared to belong to a young girl scattered about. The officer scanned for any signs of a physical fight or violence of some kind, like damage to the walls or the furniture, but there was nothing that stood out, nothing concerning. Alexandra began asking the officer pretty anxiously all these questions about, what was going on with Alan. Was he hurt? Was he in some kind of danger? What do you know? But the young officer just shook his head and said, for now, they really didn't know much. He was just here to try to build a timeline of Alan's last known movements. And so speaking of that, He asked Alexandra to please walk him through what she remembered about her last interaction with Allen. The officer took careful notes as Alexandra began to rattle off all the details she could remember. She said that Allen was like a surrogate father to her, and he had come over on the evening of Friday, February 5th. He had been there on Friday, also on Saturday and Sunday, and then he had taken off on that Sunday because he had to go to Vichy for this big meeting on Monday. She told the officer that after he left for that meeting, she hadn't heard from him, but that was pretty typical. She said their relationship was not remotely romantic, it really was platonic. And, he didn't always check in the way, a spouse would. This is more like really close friends. The officer nodded while he wrote down what she said. Alexandra seemed very helpful and appropriately worried, but he was suspicious of the idea that she and Allen were not romantically involved at all. So, before he left, he asked to see the rest of her house, in part just to see what her reaction would be. If she said no or got defensive, he would probe a bit more deeply. But she immediately agreed, and she actually took him all around the house, showing him anywhere he wanted to go. And what he found is the rest of the house seemed just as normal as the living room and the entryway. She eventually brought the officer back to the door and promised him she would call if Allen reached out. And so after leaving Alexandra's house, to be thorough, the officer actually went door to door up and down Alexandra's street, asking her neighbors what they remembered about that particular weekend and over the past several days, seeing if there was anything that contradicted what Alexandra had said. But everybody, more or less, confirmed Alexandra's story. Allen was indeed a regular visitor in the neighborhood, and several people did remember seeing him on the weekend in question and said that really nothing had seemed off. So eventually, the officer just left and went back to the station, and when he got there, he wrote a report highlighting Allen's last known destination of Vichy. Over the next week, police in Vichy, as well as in the ski town where Allen's wife lived, followed up on the loose threads of the investigation. They pored over Allen's cell phone history and his bank account and credit card transactions, which all showed no activity after he left Alexandra's house on February 7th. They also spoke to his business connections and his friends, but no one had heard anything. And they even put in a request to the car company Audi for the GPS data that was stored in Allen's car, which was an Audi Q7. Now, the investigators knew it was entirely possible that Allen had chosen to disappear. I mean, he was very wealthy, he had lots of connections, that was a possibility, that he had basically chosen to be gone. And if that was the case, it would be pretty difficult to find him. However, it was a lot harder to hide a car that logged all of its travel data. And so whether Allen's disappearance was voluntary, accidental, or the result of foul play, the police knew finding his Audi was likely the best hope they had of knowing where to even look for Allen. On February 26, 2010, so 19 days since Allen was reported missing, a detective named Pierre Martin stood in a secure impound lot in the city of Orléans, France, looking at Allen's gray Audi Q7. The GPS data that police had requested from Audi had come back a few days earlier, and it had led detectives to a surprising place. So again, the last place where Allen was known to have been before he vanished was leaving the home of his surrogate daughter, Alexandra Nicolas, near Chartres, France, and heading to Vichy, France for a business meeting. But his Audi had not been found in Chartres or Vichy. Instead, it had been discovered in the parking lot of a train station in Orléans, which was in between those two cities. And so to the police, it sort of looked like he had gotten halfway to his destination and just stopped. Now, when they found this car, the first thing they did is they just put it under surveillance for 2 days to see if maybe Allen or somebody else would return to it. For context, the parking lot where this car was in a pretty rough area where violent crime and sex work were pretty common. So, any number of people could potentially, break into this car or who knows what. It just seemed like a seedy area where something might happen here if we keep watching. But nobody had shown up. So finally, they just towed the car to the impound lot for forensic technicians to process it and look for evidence. And Detective Martin was here to watch that process. The forensic techs circled the vehicle, and began taking photos of the outside and also dusting for fingerprints. There was no visible damage anywhere on the outside of the car, and there were no traces of any effort to try to break into the car. Plus, Allen's briefcase and luggage were clearly still inside the car, which meant, the fact the car was found where it was likely not a product of a robbery. This didn't seem like somebody just stole his car. It's here and it has nothing to do with Allen's disappearance. It seems like how this car got here is connected in some way to what happened to Allen. And, sort of going down that path, it seemed more and more likely that what happened to Allen probably fell into the category of foul play. However, when the technicians opened up the car doors and began dusting for prints inside, the upholstery was disappointingly clean, which doesn't exactly sort of enhance the idea that foul play happened here. It just sort of seems like what's going on. But after a few minutes, after, kind of thoroughly scanning the inside of the car, one of the techs pushed the button near the driver's side that opened up the trunk. And then after it was open, Detective Martin walked around to the back to look inside and see what was in there. And what he saw was this bulky object wrapped in a pink sheet. And right away, Martin had this sinking feeling in his chest as one of the techs reached forward with a gloved hand and pulled the sheet back. And pretty much immediately, Martin's suspicions were confirmed. Underneath that pink sheet was a body, a man's body, fully clothed and curled in the fetal position. There was no doubt this was Allen Lilu. But there was no visible blood or wounds or bruises anywhere on his body, and there was no blood in the trunk. When Detective Martin reached in to try to move Allen's body to further examine him, he found his body was already incredibly rigid with rigor mortis. The coroner told Martin that she would hopefully have some answers for him after she did the autopsy. The weather over the past few weeks had been pretty cold, which was good for evidence collection because it basically meant the trunk had sort of acted like a refrigerator and preserved Allen's soft tissue. As the coroner wheeled the body away, Martin just stood there staring at the now empty trunk. He had no theories about when or why or even how Allen had died. All he knew was that this was now officially a murder investigation. Detective Martin returned to his office at the police station and got to work. Since Allen's body was found in Orléans, he was now in charge of the murder investigation. His first step was to review all the witness statements and other evidence that had already been gathered by the other departments. And right away, the picture they painted told Martin that this was going to be a very complex investigation with lots of suspects and multiple locations. Allen was a workaholic who was always on the move, and he had no apparent connection to the city of Orléans, where he had ended up. In fact, he rarely seemed to spend more than a few days in the same place. He didn't live with his wife. Instead, he seemed to bounce between his office and a series of hotels, with stops at the home of a woman named Alexandra Nicola in between. According to reports, Alexandra had been interviewed, and she said that Allen was at her house the weekend before he disappeared. And so this made her the last person to see Allen alive, which, in Martin's mind, clearly made her a suspect right off the bat. However, Alexandra's story about Allen leaving her house on Sunday, February 6th, matched up with the data Martin had from Allen's car, cell phone, and credit card records, which all showed that Allen really did leave her house and went to Orléans on that day, and then, for reasons unknown, stopped communicating or spending money. Maybe that was the day he was killed. Right off the bat, like the police officer who originally visited Alexandra and took down her original story, Detective Martin found it pretty hard to believe that her relationship with Allen was not romantic. It just seemed like, based on how frequently they apparently saw each other and the fact that Allen was buying her things and, bought her house and paid for vacations and things like that, it just seemed like there was more to the story than what he had been told. But even though that did totally cast some level of suspicion on Alexandra, there was also just the logical side of it for Detective Martin, which is like, okay, the size difference between Allen and Alexandra was stark. I mean, Allen was 240 pounds, a really big guy, and Alexandra was just very small and petite. Now, is it impossible for her to kill him and put him in the trunk of the car in Orleans? No, but it just makes it sort of unlikely. And so that's just sort of floating in the background of Detective Martin's mind. But for now, what Martin found himself much more interested in was some of the other information that Alan's business associates and wife had supplied. First off, Alan apparently had lots of affairs with lots of women. And so that meant every one of those women, and any husbands or boyfriends or other romantic partners of any kind connected to them, were also suspects. It also meant that Alan's wife, Elizabeth, had a motive to want her husband dead. I mean, basically, he's cheating on her openly all the time. That's got to be motivation for her to do something to him. Now, Martin didn't think that Elizabeth literally would have done the killing herself, because she was actually 400 miles away at her home when her husband died. But she certainly had the financial means to hire a hitman. And the second thing that Detective Martin got from the associates and from Alan's wife was Alan's business dealings were both very high stakes and very ugly. Alan's employees and colleagues clearly respected him, but they also described him as a very tough boss and a ruthless business person. He could be very loud and abrasive, and he had already made his fair share of enemies in the circus business, which was already known to be a cutthroat industry where a lot of money was flying around. And so because Martin had been handed this murder investigation, and really there's like an overwhelming number of people that could have been involved here, instead of just, not being sure where to start, Martin just assembled a team of his very best deputies, and they set to work literally re-interviewing everybody, and from that, making a list of suspects that they deemed were appropriate. Three weeks later, on March 17th, Detective Martin walked into an interrogation room in the Orleans police station, and he sat down across from a relatively fit-looking 50-year-old man who was waiting for him quietly and apparently very calmly. The man's name was Michel de la Rue, and he was Alan's biggest rival in the circus business. He was also, at this very moment, Detective Martin's #1 suspect in this murder. Martin and his team had spent the last few weeks conducting dozens and dozens of interviews, and Michel's name had come up more times than anybody else's. And this was because, immediately after Alan disappeared, Michel had begun contacting Alan's clients, trying to get them to all sign new contracts with him, sort of a pretty cutthroat and cold thing to do. And Detective Martin had done the math on these contracts Michel was going for, and they added up to the equivalent of millions of dollars, which in the detective's mind was a very compelling motive for murder. Maybe Michel killed this guy specifically to gobble up these contracts. And not only that, but the coroner had by this point come back with Alan's cause of death. He had been strangled using some kind of ligature, like a rope or a belt, and it likely took between 5 and maybe 10 minutes for Alan to actually be strangled to death. So, the idea is someone's actively strangling him for that long. That is a long time to be right there on top of somebody, killing someone. And then the scratches that were found on Alan's legs suggested that his body had been lifted into the trunk after he was already dead. So the death struggle, the actual strangling, clearly took place outside of the trunk. And so all that meant whoever killed Alan had to be pretty strong. And looking at Michel now, Detective Martin thought that he did fit the description. He seemed like a pretty fit, strong guy. However, as Martin began asking Michel questions and watching his face and body language for signs of anxiety or defensiveness that could suggest he was hiding something, what he found was Michel seemed pretty open and very straightforward, like he was not hiding a thing. Michel immediately acknowledged poaching Alan's clients, but he just shrugged as he explained it. That was business. He said he was sure if somehow the positions were reversed, Alan would do the same thing to him. And also, he said he had an airtight alibi. On the weekend, when the coroner believed Alan had been killed, Michel had been hundreds of miles away skiing. And then Michel produced this folder full of these receipts and all these phone numbers, and he handed it over to Martin, who took it, and he told Michel, okay, sit tight. And then the detective got up and he left the interrogation room and he handed over this folder to another detective to check out. But after that, Detective Martin did not go back into the interrogation room. Instead, he grabbed another detective and told them to take a shot. The idea was to sort of have a good cop, bad cop sort of dynamic to see if maybe that would rattle Michel. And so Detective Martin watched from behind the two-way mirror as the next detective walked inside and took a stab at, breaking Michel. But their conversation basically played out the same way that Martin's had. So Martin signaled for another detective to go in there and have them take a shot. But they too had a sort of run-of-the-mill conversation with Michel, and they didn't make any progress. And then finally, after basically hours of cycling different detectives into the room to try to catch Michel in a lie, Detective Martin felt a tap on his shoulder. And when he turned around, it was one of his deputies who told Martin that unfortunately he had called all the people that Michel had given them information for, all the witnesses from the ski resort, and he had also even called the manager of the ski lodge. And basically, Michel's alibi checked out. He clearly had not been physically able to kill Alan. He was at that ski resort at the time of the murder. At this point, Martin knew he could not just keep Michel indefinitely and just keep trying to catch him in a lie. Even if there was some possibility here that he was involved in this murder, at this point, there just wasn't enough evidence. And so he had to let Michel go. A few days later, Martin was back at his desk combing through reports when a uniformed officer came up and told him there was somebody at the front desk who really wanted to talk to him. And this was exactly the kind of news that Martin had been hoping for. He had recently put out a statement to the local papers basically saying, hey, if there are any witnesses out there, please come in and talk to me. And he hoped that whoever this was potentially a witness. And so Detective Martin followed the uniformed officer out to the lobby, and there he saw the person who had come in to see him. It was this man who appeared to be in his early 50s, who was dressed all in black with these shiny black shoes and glasses. And Martin wondered if maybe this was a business contact of Alan's. And as he went up to shake the man's hand, he sort of felt himself getting excited. But then this man introduced himself, and when he did, Martin had to resist the urge to just turn around and walk away right there. Because the man said his name was Remy Saint-Touren, and he was a professional psychic. Martin did not believe in psychics, and he was annoyed with the police officer for even bringing him out here to meet this person. And so Martin was literally about to just tell Remy to, thanks for coming in, but I don't have time for this, you need to go. But then he thought better of it, because Martin was really having no luck with this case. There had been very little forensic evidence recovered from Alan's car. There were no usable fingerprints, and while the bedsheet Alan's body was wrapped in did have some DNA on it, it didn't match anything in their system. And then the business leads that Martin had been pretty excited about hadn't panned out either, and he'd found no evidence that anyone in either Alan's personal or business circles took out a paid hit on him. Martin's team had also spoken at length to Alan's surrogate daughter Alexandra and all the women he was having affairs with and all the sex workers he had engaged with, and none of them, nor any of their boyfriends or husbands or partners, made sense as the killer. So, out of a mixture of a little curiosity and a lot of desperation, Martin brought Remy the psychic back to an interrogation room and asked him what he thought. Remy explained that he had heard a news bulletin about Alan while he was driving, and when he heard it, he had a vision that was so vivid that he actually had to pull over. He said he saw Alan Lilu as clear as day in this physical struggle with a woman. Remy didn't know her name, and he couldn't describe her, but he was certain that a woman was somehow involved in Alan's murder. Martin was disappointed because, unsurprisingly, this just sort of felt like a generic stab in the dark by somebody parading around as a psychic who could see things that nobody else could. It just seemed like he threw this random generic thing out there as if it was some big revelation, and it just didn't feel like it was. But Remy wasn't done. He went on to say he was sure that Alan was not killed in Orléans, even though that's where his body had been found. He said Alan's body had been taken away from the murder scene and actually placed in the trunk after he was dead. And this caught Martin's attention, because the coroner had been certain that Allen was strangled in one place and then placed into the trunk afterwards for transportation. But critically, the police had not released that information to the press, specifically because they wanted to be able to weed out fake tips. And so for Remy to say that, how would he have access to that? Now, Martin knew this could have just been a lucky guess by Remy, but it just seemed so, on the nose that he began considering what else Remy had said. This idea that, okay, Allen was struggling with this woman. That was something that, Martin had not really considered. He had sort of ruled most women out as the potential suspect because of how big Allen had been and how physical this murder had to have been. So it just seemed more likely that a big, strong man was responsible for the killing. But now, Martin wasn't so sure. And suddenly it seemed entirely possible that, maybe a woman really did do this. And so eventually, Detective Martin thanked Remy for coming in and sharing his ideas about the case. And then after walking him out of the station, Detective Martin sped back to his desk. Because Martin had an idea. Lots of people in Allen's life had told the police investigating his murder that Allen had had lots of extramarital affairs. Now, Detective Martin and his team had spoken to all the women they could possibly find who had had these affairs with Allen, and basically all of them had been ruled out. However, now, after talking with Remy the psychic, something about the location where Allen's body was found was jumping out at Detective Martin. The part of Orleans where Allen's car had been parked was pretty sketchy, it was crime-ridden, and critically, it was known for being a hotbed for sex work. Now, Martin already knew, clearly, that Allen engaged with sex workers. It just seemed like that was one of the things that he did, and they spoke to numerous sex workers and ruled them out as being suspects. And so for the most part, sex workers were not really on Detective Martin's radar as, primary suspect pool. However, now with fresh eyes, he was thinking, maybe the reason Allen was in Orleans was because he was there to meet a sex worker, and while he was there, something went wrong, and it resulted in his death. So, Detective Martin spent the next few days absolutely scouring Allen's laptop. Now, the forensic techs had already been through it once, looking at all of Allen's emails and business records, but Martin was looking at something different. He was using the laptop to search through all the websites where Allen had found sex workers to go visit. Basically, what he was doing is making a true exhaustive list of every single sex worker he had ever really engaged with. So this is an even bigger list than they had before. There were dozens of names and profiles to sift through, and as Martin found them, he would send members of his team out to speak to all the women he possibly could. But as he was doing this, Detective Martin discovered that really none of these sex workers that Allen was engaging with had any connection to Orleans, and they also did not appear to have any real issues with Allen himself, at least based on the messages that were on his laptop. However, as Detective Martin dug deeper and deeper into this laptop, going further and further back in time, he eventually came to one new profile, this woman named Marie Eve. And when he took in who this woman was and got a picture of her and saw her information, he knew right then and there he had solved the case. Based on the entire police investigation, as well as a confession from the killer, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Allen Lelou on the day he was murdered. The killer found themselves standing behind Allen, and inside, they were burning with rage. Allen seemed to think he was so much better than the killer, just because he was this powerful businessman, and the killer was just a sex worker. And the killer had tolerated Allen's behavior because, Allen had money. But now, Allen had pushed it too far, and the killer felt like they had to shut him up for good. Allen's belt lay nearby, and impulsively, the killer grabbed it and lunged forward and looped the belt around Allen's throat. And at first, Allen struggled. He reached up, he's trying to pull the belt off, he has no idea what's happening, but the killer just held on tight. And for several minutes, there's this unbelievable death struggle going on. And Allen, he's fighting. He's a big guy and he's getting close to pulling this thing off. But then something sort of unbelievable happened. The killer had sort of braced themselves against an object behind them. And so their back is up against it and they're pulling as hard as they can with this belt against Allen's throat. And as they're leaning back, the object they're up against suddenly broke. And because, the killer didn't let go of the belt and is applying max pressure, when they fell backwards, it created almost like this whiplash effect. Their body tumbles and all that force is driven into Allen's throat. And what happened is that sudden whiplash crushed Allen's larynx, and he immediately went still. And so just for good measure, the killer held on for a couple more minutes, pulling as tightly as they could across his throat, really ensuring that Allen was dead. And when Allen did not move at all, eventually the killer let go of the belt and stood up, their heart pounding, just sort of taking in the scene. Then, as reality began to set in for the killer, they realized they needed help getting rid of this body. This is a huge guy. How are they going to get rid of it on their own? So the killer called their accomplice. And the accomplice was hundreds of miles away in a ski resort, but they immediately told the killer to wait and they would drive to them. Sure enough, the next day, the accomplice arrived and they helped the killer load Allen's body into the trunk of Allen's car. Then the killer climbed into Allen's car and drove it to the train station in Orleans. Behind them, as they made this ride, police would realize much later there was a second car being driven by the killer's accomplice. The killer and the accomplice would abandon Allen's car and his body in Orleans, and then together they would drive away, and shortly thereafter, they would actually get married. Because the killer was Allen's own surrogate daughter, Alexandra Nicola. Alexandra's troubled past that she was very defensive about included the fact that she was actually a sex worker under the name Marie Eve. Her accomplice was her new boyfriend, Yves Bernard. So Alexandra and Allen had fought previously about her, troubled history, and she was especially mad that at one point, Allen had implied that Alexandra's daughter could sort of end up like her, as if that would be a horrible thing. So on Saturday, February 6th, when Allen brought up Alexandra's daughter, just sort of in conversation, for Alexandra, something snapped. It just felt so disrespectful that he, again, was talking about her daughter, and sort of out of impulse, she grabbed the belt, wrapped it around Allen's neck, strangled him, and ultimately stumbled backwards and crushed his larynx and killed him. In a way, it was sort of true what Alexandra had told the police when they initially questioned her, that Allen had left her house in his car on February 7th, and she had not seen him again. What she had left out was that Allen was already dead in the trunk of his car when he left. Alexandra Nicola confessed to the murder of Allen Lilu and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Her boyfriend, Yves Bernard, was sentenced to 2 years for concealment of a dead body. The couple has since been released, and together they have a child who was born before Alexandra went to prison. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.